Chapter 5. Thump. Clouds gathered over the gravesite. The temperature was dropping. It had been weeks since it last rained, but today it was finally coming to the dusty, sun-baked prairies. Half the community of White Rock gathered at the village cemetery to pay their last respects and to show their support to the Kettlefish family. The other half carried on with life as usual. Tyrone hated every one of them in that moment. Since when did any of these people actually care for them or their family? He looked around at the faces surrounding the hole in the ground and scoffed under his breath. He wanted nothing to do with any of these fakes and phonies. Why couldn't it be any one of them in this grave rather than my sister, he thought. She didn't deserve this. My family doesn't deserve this. For all he cared, they could all burn in hell. Thump. Kenny Kettlefish held his wife up as she sobbed uncontrollably. It had been several days and the RCMP hadn't come up with anything concrete. There had been many rumors around town that some East Indian guys had been seen coasting through White Rock and other nearby reserves, and that a few of the girls had gone missing. But most of those rumors were unsubstantiated. Kenny had lost his temper with the investigating officer. All his questions centered around how many times each week his daughter drank, what her sexual activity was like, was she ever involved in the sex trade on the streets of Regina or Saskatoon? Every question they asked him made him more and more angry that their insinuation was that she deserved it because she lived a high-risk lifestyle. His daughter was not like that. Tanisha was a good mom. She loved her sons. Her worst fault was choosing a man who was nothing like him. Her boyfriend was nothing like the man Kenny was. Kenny was a hard-working man. He was a stalwart for his family. He loved hunting and fishing. When times were financially tough, Kenny was always able to provide. Up until a few years ago, he had worked seasonally as a carpenter for Red Feather Construction Engineering. He knew the reasons why all the projects had dried up, but he was glad that he had learned at a young age how to provide for his family. Residential school had not taken that away from him, although they tried every means to do so. He felt sorry for most of those who had never had that opportunity to learn to like he had. He saw the hard lives they had lived, and he saw how many lives had been lost to those traumatic and tragic years that should have been a child's most precious. For him and thousands of other Indigenous children, those years were a nightmare. Unlike some other students, he never suffered any sexual abuse, but the physical abuse he suffered at the hands of teachers and other students had taken its toll in his early adult life. Like many others, he drank, smoked, and drugged his pain away. He had lost a couple of childhood friends under strange circumstances. The priests and nuns had said that his friends had gone home, but yet he hadn't seen them packing their clothes. He'd seen the nuns packing, and when he asked why, he was told to go back to minding his own business. Just like the investigating police officers who told him to control himself, or he'd be taken to jail. They told him to leave the investigation up to them, and yet they had nothing to offer. But like he had learned to do many, many years before, he forgave them and surrendered their actions and his anger into the hands of God Almighty, the Creator of all things. Thump. The sound broke him from his thoughts. Kenny felt his wife shake in his arms and his own tears began streaming. For several days he had held back the tears in order to be strong for Anna and the grandchildren, but now he could no longer hold them in. Off in the distance, White Rock River wept with the Kettlefish family. Thump. Tyrone was angry. Angry at everyone. Angry at his brother Terrell. Terrell should have been here. He had told Tyrone that he was going to the city because he couldn't handle or deal with what had happened. Everyone was trying to reach Terrell, but the calls to his cell phone would only go straight to his full voicemail. And now, no one knew where he was. Tyrone couldn't understand why his brother wouldn't be here on the day his family needed him the most. He looked over at his mom and dad. He'd never seen his dad cry like he was today. Pain ran through Tyrone's body. And when he looked over at the two little boys hanging onto his parents' hands, tears in their eyes, Tyrone's hurt wanted to burst, and so did the tears from his eyes. But instead of letting them flow, he choked them back and fed his anger instead. Thump. As the minister committed her body into the ground, hatred, anger, and malice rose up in Tyrone. He wanted revenge for whoever had done this. He suspected that the Crips had to have been involved. The Crips, an indigenous street gang, had been rumored to be on the reserve trying to coax girls to join them. The girls would ultimately be forced into the sex trade in Regina. They were promised rewards of money, drugs, and freedom. What they usually got instead was rape, overdoses, and death. Many were still missing. His sister had mentioned that a couple of goofs, a name that any reserve kid knew to mean a gang member, had been seen riding around town and had been following her on her way back from the store that month. Tyrone knew of at least 3 guys on the res that had ties to the Crips. Yeah, they know something, he thought, and I'm going to find out. Tyrone had his own connections to the street gangs of Regina. His older brother had once spent a year in the city and was friends with members of the Native Syndicate, the largest street gang in Regina. If the Crips had anything to do with his sister's death, the police would never find out. They'd proven that over the years that the life of an Indian girl mattered little, and they would not allocate any additional resources just to find out who did it. Let the natives kill each other seemed to be a hidden credo of the RCMP. As far as Tyrone was concerned, you couldn't trust the police to do anything to help. No, the only way they would find out who did was to do the groundwork themselves, even if it meant putting their lives in danger. Tyrone decided the first goof he would observe would be Tony Big Eagle. He was several years older than Tyrone, but Tyrone knew that Tony Big Eagle was once one of the most feared Crip gang leaders in Regina. Tony had been involved in a series of armed robberies and violent assaults. He had spent a few years behind bars, and upon his release he had come out and did not return to the gang life. People said that he had had a religious experience in jail. Thump. The sound suddenly brought Tyrone back to the reality in front of him. The last 5 days had been beyond surreal. It had all seemed like a nightmare that would just not end. A cloud had surrounded him, his vision, his speech, his hands and feet. It was as if nothing he did was voluntary. Who had come and gone in those 5 days, he couldn't tell you. The overtly racist RCMP visits, the visitors, his mother's sobs and screams, David and Joshua crying and asking for mommy. All of it was too much. He was just drifting from one bad scene to another terrible scene in a horrific dream. Thump. The sound was like a drumbeat hitting his chest with the force of a sledgehammer. It was too much. Tyrone let out a deep, guttural moan that broke loose a flood of tears that he had fought so hard to keep locked away for the past 5 days. The catatonic stare that had filled his face for the last few days was gone. In its place was a face of agony and anguish that mirrored the pain erupting from deep within Tyrone. She was gone. Tanisha would not be back. Thump. The final shovelful of dirt covered the hole where Tanisha now lay. Nothing, however, could ever fill the hole left in the Kettlefish family, at least not in Tyrone's heart. As the lone musician softly sang Amazing Grace on his guitar, a respective hush fell over the friends and community members gathered there as the Kettlefish family huddled together, weeping under the wet, cloudy skies of White Rock. Everyone's thoughts and eyes were on the family. Had anyone looked up, they may have noticed a lonely figure standing among the trees, watching. from afar.